Welcome, everybody. My name is Roger Durling, Executive Director of the Santa Barbara International Film Festival, and I'm very honored to be here to talk about the film Dara of Jasenovac. It's Serbia's official submission for the Academy Awards, and we're here with the director, Predrag Antonijević, and please correct me your name. And then also with the executive producer, Michael Berenbaum, who's the director of the Sigi Zurich Institute at the American Jewish University as well. Welcome, gentlemen. I'm very honored to have you guys here. I'm going to start with Peter. Peter, can you tell us the journey of this film? When was the first time that this idea of making a film about this concentration camp came about?
It's been 76 years this year since the chain of concentration camp known as Jasenovac was liberated, but that story was never being told as a feature, for the big screen. There were some books written and there were some documentaries done. And I've been thinking about that for a very long time because it's a very sore moment in the history of the nations in Balkans. And then a few years ago, I talked to Michael, and then we kind of started working on that idea, and that's how the movie came about. Later, the screenwriter Nataša Drakulić, who is from Croatia, Serbian from Croatia, and who had a few family members killed in a concentration camp during the Second World War. She came aboard as a writer, and that's how the project was, conceived, and here we are now.
Peter, but were you aware of it, growing up and going to school and history books? Were you aware of the history?
Yes, very much so, because it's a part of collective, let's say, consciousness of the entire nation. And, it's a very troubled relationship between some of those ethnic groups in the Balkans, in the former Yugoslavia, Croats and Serbs and Bosnian Muslims. And this was a concentration camp, and Michael maybe should tell you more about that as a historian, which was established by Croats during the Second World War, when the country was run by a Nazi government called Ustashi. And that was the only non-German established and non-German run concentration camp in Europe. And of course, I knew a lot about it. I read many books, but there is always a need kind of to try to tell the story as a filmmaker for the big screen. And I would certainly like Michael also to maybe give you some more details on the historic background of the camps.
Yeah, go ahead, please, Michael.
The very interesting thing about Jasenovac is it was the only death camp that was not established by the Nazis, but established by the native regime, the Ustasha. And it was used as their contribution to the final solution of the Jewish problem. And also they killed Roman Sinti, or called Gypsies. And once they were at that, they also killed Serbs as part of the ethnic cleansing. And one of the things that you have to realize is that Yugoslavia, which in America seemed to have been a country, was really an amalgam of multiple nationalities held together by a charismatic figure. And when he died and left, that's when the ethnic clashes began again. And they were settled in the 90s, not with anybody coming to a resolution, but with everybody tiring of the killing and seeing the necessity to go beyond killing. And I discovered something very interesting in all of my conversations in the Balkans, and I've been all over the place, is that nobody believes they won the battles of the 1990s or that the Dayton Accords settled them. They always believe the next guy got it worse.
No.
So it's not that you have to win, it's you have to perceive that the other guy got it worse. But this deals with World War II, and this deals with a very unique, and one of the other aspects of Jasenovac is it had a children's camp. And children's camp was used for re-education. And re-education was in order to increase change the religion, change the identity of the Serbian children who were deemed to be sufficiently superior to become part of the Croatian nation.
Mhm.
And this is something also that mirrored what Germany did with the Lebensborn.
And Peter, when did you decide? We see the film through the eyes of Dara, through the children's eyes. When did you decide to focus the story on the children?
Actually, it was a result of our initial, Michael's and my initial discussion about the movie, because there are like two reasons, obviously. You have this whole evil and horrific things happening all the time. How you depict them, how you show the horrors. You have to show the horrors, otherwise you don't do the justice to the story and to the real, let's say, history of the camp. But also, if you do it in such a gruesome way, you're going to lose the audience along the way, and then you simply won't be able to tell the story. And by then deciding on point of view of a young kid, you are able to kind of participate directly in the events unfolding in front of her eyes, but also back off the events into her eyes, and keep audience emotionally engaged while you are really not showing all the time horrors happening. That was, I would say, the only way to go about it. But also there is a, let's say, from a dramatic standpoint, very important thing to have the kid, symbol of the innocence, and getting into this, tragic, and going through all these tragic events and horrific events, and coming of age under those circumstances is basically no time in order to survive and protect her brother. That also gives you fantastic, let's say, arch of the character throughout the whole story, and that also helps tremendously in keeping the audience engaged as she basically comes of age during this story.
There's
Let me add a
go ahead,
drop
Michael.
to
Yeah,
drop.
go ahead.
If you show not enough violence, you're sugarcoating what's there. If you show too much violence, the audience withdraws, or it becomes numb. It
Right.
closes itself up. And what Gaga did at very important moments was to use the eyes of the child as a way of seeing the violence without seeing the violence, and make the audience imagine what that child is seeing.
Mm-hmm.
Because he was working with children, that had to be the child's acting, because he didn't allow her to see all that was going on, because you can't do that to a real child. And consequently, and he chose wisely and with a considerable amount of difficulty. He really chose children from the areas in which the populations had been taken. Kids who grew up on farms, who grew up with animals, for whom death is not a strange occurrence. And consequently, in the expression of the eyes, you see the horror of what's experienced, but you don't have to see it firsthand. Not
Correct.
fully.
I mean, the really powerful thing about the film, the point of view, is that we ourselves as an audience don't know, we have to start to figure things out, what is happening beyond the things that we're seeing, just the same way that Dara is not getting all the information of what's happening everywhere else. The audience is in that position as well. And it's a very intriguing way to there's an involvement as an audience member because of that. Yeah.
And he switches also to
The Danja Gradina aspect?
Yeah, the body, the part of the killing that became ironically difficult and hampering for the killers. It was easy to kill. It was much more difficult to get rid of the bodies.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
he shows you also how the people who are burying the bodies begin to try to piece together what's happening at the other camp.
Mm-hmm.
And that becomes, again, an intriguing way in which it unfolds. And as he does that, the audience does that as well.
And Peter, can Gaga, your nickname. When did you decide? Yeah, we do have two parallel stories happening. We have the camp where Dara is at, and then we have her father, Mile, who is at a different location. It's called Danja Gradina, where is the burials happening?
Donja Gradina or just Gradina, that was actually just across the river Sava from the one of the camps of Jasenovac. And basically they would bring the bodies there, and the people bodies were buried there, a lot of them, and thrown into the river Sava, and they were floating down the river, way down to the Belgrade. It was even, there were some photos and some, stories that even Belgrade, which is a couple of maybe 150 kilometers down the river, there were bodies, coming, and floating from Jasenovac. The reason we opted for these two, let's say, parallel stories is basically very simple. They exist, in a kind of a parallel way, and the thoughts about family maybe being there and being alive keeps the father alive and keeps his spirits up. But same applies also to Dara, and that she keeps thinking what her father is, he's alive. And essentially there is this, in a way, reunion, which is not a reunion, physical reunion at the end, but basically it was the way of keeping the two fires burning at the same time, not only one, in a spiritual way, and also in as a motivation for leading characters, to keep moving and keep doing things to try to save, themselves from the camp.
Michael, everything that we're seeing is based on facts. Can you talk about the characters being composites, and based on actual historical?
Well, the characters are composite, and there are moments where the composite is not only a composite, but it's actually real. The most gripping moment of that is there's a scene in the movie in which the mother refuses to go off to Germany and leave her son behind. The woman who played that and she gets killed. The woman who played that was the granddaughter of the mother who refused to leave her child behind. And consequently, when she played it, and it's a minute and a half, maybe 2 minutes maximum, but when she played it, it was her family story. It brought to it an authenticity and integrity that was there. Let's take another example, which almost has biblical overtones. The early scene, which shows a mother leaving her infant in the bushes to be picked up by another woman. That's an incredible moment in which you have to identify that in three ways. You have to identify as a parent, what is a moment in which you love a child enough to understand that you can't protect the child, and then you give the child away, hoping that this woman, and there's only a brief signal, hoping that this woman will pick her up and take her out of the bushes. This has been true in situations of oppression since the Moses story in the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
And the incredible thing is that as I see this in the Holocaust, I go back to Poland very often, and there are about 7,000 people now who are in their 50s and 60s and 70s, now in their 70s, who really only discovered sometime in their adult life that they were adopted and saved by parents who gave away their children. So you see a scene like that, and you begin, I begin to see it, and I see, and what's going to happen 50 years from now? And what's going to happen 60 years from that moment, because I've seen it happen. So the more I always advise filmmakers, you don't have to add drama, you merely have to let the drama speak forth. The scene of the gassing, in which an officer throws Zyklon B down into a cellar, that actually happened. And that was part of it. The role of the nuns. Normally we think of nuns as embodiments of mercy and safety. And here they are, instruments of a persecution that is ethnic, but also religious, and doing an awful lot of the task of re-education, and not serving as sisters of mercy, but as instruments of oppression. That happened. And we have to face that happened. As we see today, all sorts of religious rivalries that lead to oppression.
Mm. So the character, there is a priest at the beginning of the film, Fra Mastorovic.
Yes.
That was an actual historical character.
Yes, that's a historical character. He was a serving priest near the city of Banja Luka in the northern part of Bosnia. And then the paradox was that his wife was Serbian. But as everything kind of started, he gave a speech to his fellow Croats and got them excited enough that they went, and in one night they killed 2,000 people in the villages around. He became probably the worst monster of them all. Yeah, he was a serving priest, you know, in the church, Catholic Church, and it's a known character. Was after the war tried and sentenced to death. So is that guy who did the gassing of the kids, Ante Vrban. He confessed to that. It was 67 kids he gassed at one moment, and he was, prosecuted after the war and sentenced to death as well. However, for instance, you have a scene when two younger Nazi officers, a girl and a guy, make love while there is this music chair, scene. Both historic characters. The young girl is the sister of this concentration camp main guy who gives the speech, and who is a commander of them all. And she fell in love during the Jasenovac, in Jasenovac with this other young officer, Dinko Šakić, and she was another, Šakić later. They got married, they fell in love, they had their love story, they had beautiful moments of for themselves. And that's again true fact that young guy later became a commander himself of the camp towards the end of the war, and finally they escaped to Argentina after the war, both of them. And also basically the main commander of all these camps is that guy Max Luborić, who is the guy in charge of a music chair, music chair scene, who is commanding the music and everything. He gives a speech later in the movie when they line up all the. Yeah, that's his original speech. It's on radio, was on the radio, and we took a part of that speech, very end of the speech, and put it there. In other words, it's not. It's very true to the facts. What did happen with all these characters. This guy in particular also escaped the justice and was killed in their internal struggle in 1968, by some rivaling faction of Ustashi movement in Spain. He was killed. But all I'm saying is we tried really as much to follow the historic facts, to do the justice to this story, but also, as Michael said, you don't need to invent any fictional moments, because unfortunately there was so many horrible things on the table that you just need to let it play, you know.
And one of the victims of a concentration camp, a great psychoanalyst by the name of Viktor Frankl, said that if a person had a nightmare in the camps, you never woke them up, because the reality is worse than the imagination could imagine. Wow. And ordinarily, if somebody has a nightmare, you wake them up, because you bring them back to a reality that, however bad, is somehow safer than the nightmare. Not there. So what I tell filmmakers, and Gaga and I have been longtime friends, is let the drama speak forth. You don't have to invent, you have to call from and cully from. And the other part of it is that the death of millions of people is a statistic. Dara is a person. And the audience begins to identify with that person, begins to identify with her and with her struggle to keep her young Buddha, her brother, alive. And that's when the story becomes emotionally real and not only intellectually informative.
Could you, I was shocked to see the primitive violence that was used in the camp, mallets and knives and strangulation, to both of you, Gaga, and to Michael, why the difference in the way of killing that we're not used to seeing?
Well, this goes back to the core. The Germans tried to minimize that. In other words, part of the reason they introduced gas chambers and crematoria was to minimize the human contact between the killer and the victim, and that allowed them psychologically to continue this year in, year out, year in, year out. Part of the primitiveness means that there is a personalness to the killing, which has an impact on the killer themselves and obviously on the victim. It also puts the victim in a very particular in a very particular situation, because sometimes death is only whimsical. Good day, good moment, bad moment. And the violence can be overwhelming, and it calls forth a violation of every canon of one's humanity in the process.
For instance, if I may just add.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
It's for instance, like you have the music chairs, scene, and the guy has actually that curved knife here, which is tied to his wrist, and actually that was invented and created that whoever was slashing the throats of the people will not get tired, because if you are just holding with your hand the knife, you cannot do that many people, and it was called Srbosjek, or rather Serb slasher, and it's in the museum now. Over there they use that, and that's why it's kind of what Michael is saying. Sometimes I think is it specific to the Balkans? I don't think so. I think it's general in a human race. We are capable of doing horrible things, to each other, and we keep doing them all over again. But the level of this primitive personal violence was also exclusive to this camp, because they just did all these things, in a very personal and direct ways. Like the bullet was probably the most sophisticated way of killing the other person. And I don't know what to say. It's kind of always a reminder that in no time the human race can slip again into some, horrific times and horrific way of behaving like we did have in these concentration camps during the Second World War. And that's why it's always good to remind us all that we should search for good in ourselves first and foremost, and then find the good in the other people, because we witness that discrimination is still present for the religious, gender, race, And it's always a very small step from discrimination to some, horrific things. And human race proved that, many times over in the history that it could happen.
You mentioned the musical chairs sequence. I want to ask you, right before we went on camera, you talked about how, the difficulty of deciding how to shoot that scene and how much, to show, not to turn off the audience, but enough to show the horror. Can you tell us about that sequence? And
that was probably the most complex sequence in the movie, because you do have giving a birth in the brick
That's
factory,
right, yeah.
in the, at the same time as you have Dara witnessing the scene, these two young Nazi officers, making a love, as well as the situation with the people running for their lives around those chairs. And one of them decides not to run anymore and not to fight for his life. And there are like a number of all these points, which was very hard to kind of put together, that the rhythm-wise, I'm talking now as a filmmaker, that the rhythm-wise you don't lose it, but you still kind of be able to go from one of those scenes into another position and gain momentum instead of losing it. It was very, very difficult scene, and the scene I kind of, to be very honest, I had it in my head. I did not have it shot by shot, let's say storyboarded or anything like that, not at all, because I just felt like, okay, I know that, certain things are building on several points, giving a birth, music chairs, what's happening at the table, love making, etc., etc. And I kind of took me a while to digest that and to find like a rhythm in my heart, how that should, come together. And I was, I think that was good at the end, but it was shot from a head, not from the storyboard, and I kind of shot that scene for, I think, three nights. And, I thought maybe I will need to come back at some point after I edited that, because I was not quite sure whether rhythm-wise everything will look right. But at the end of the day, we didn't. Somehow everything fell right into the place, and that was it. It was difficult scene to, orchestrate everything.
No, but I mean, my point was about that. What you mentioned earlier before we went on is that finding the fine line between showing the horror but not turning off the audience.
It's not having the audience withdraw.
Correct.
Your first tendency when you see that is to cover your eyes. I don't need to see this. Now, the fact that at several moments you withdrew because you had another drama taking place, which was not a drama of death, but a drama of life. You had a third drama taking place, which was love-making, which could also be life-making, as it were, but people withdrawing from the scene because they knew that everybody would be gripped by the scene and they could get off and have a romantic thrust. And finally, and I think the most important part of that, is the audience imagined what continued to go on as they saw Dara's eyes try to take in that scene and understand what had to be for any 10-year-old, because I'm far from 10, it was incomprehensible to me. What had to be an incomprehensible scene? How could such evil take place? And how could people relish that and think that that is the way you entertain a high-ranking Nazi official?
Gaga, did you shoot the film chronologically?
Yes, I did. The reason we did that was kids. We knew kids would be growing up. The movie was shot during the course of 3 months, like 58 shooting days, but 3 months. And 3 months is a long time when the kids are at that age. We kind of had to, expand their costumes twice. And we knew that it would be very important to do it in order, but also for a reason to get kids adapted for their roles, that it will be much easier for them to kind of follow the story of their character, and that's why we shot the movie in the order, and which obviously production-wise gives you a lot of, headache. And we were joking like young Budo, who was slightly below a year and a half, actually grew up significantly. He had a good appetite, And sorry, but you don't notice that because it's shot in the order, But we were joking since Dara Biljana Čekić is a very tiny girl, that at the beginning Dara was carrying the Budo, which was the first scene in the movie when she's carrying him. But at the end, Budo was carrying Dara, because Budo grew up big time. But, you don't notice that. That's why we had to do it in a chronological order. And I think it paid off.
And just to clarify, the kids, I'm assuming the kids were not exposed to any of the violence that they were.
No. This is we went, as Michael said previously, around the villages, from regional mountain Kozara, where lots of people were taken during the Second World War and, sent to the camp. And those kids are villages, live in villages. They are in touch with animals, real life. And we were thinking like, okay, how are we gonna secure these kids when they come to the set and they are in some scenes which are, tough scenes. And of course, we brought psychologists, we brought their teachers from their villages, we brought their parents, we built them a rec room. We were thinking like, okay, they'll be taken care of. Always somebody will be talking to them. But these kids are of a different kind. They come from a different era, and during the breaks, they did not play on the games on the cell phones. They will sit down on the ground and talk, and then all of a sudden they were like behaving like adults and say, okay, this has to be done. We are doing this, we are doing that. And it was just unbelievable feel. And these kids made this movie possible,
Yeah. Michael, the original camp was leveled and destroyed, and Gaga and his team built up the production design. How accurate was what we see visually of the buildings and the camp?
You don't have a full and complete understanding of what Jasenovac looked like in its original. So you try to achieve the measure of authenticity that is possible. And you try to use a site that had been abandoned, that was created at that time and earlier, and had been repurposed for this camp. So I think they achieved a visual authenticity, though I have it's not like Auschwitz, which is preserved, or Majdanek, which is even the Nazi death camps, which were, Majdanek was captured whole before the Nazis had a chance to destroy it. Jasenovac was run into the ground as part of it. So I think they chose the scenes wisely and the places smartly, and that's what gives the film a feeling of authenticity and integrity.
Yeah. We were actually looking to recreate mostly that camp number 3, which was built around the brick factory. And there are some photos, but not really detailed photos, some photos from outside, and we saw how that looked like. And it's known that there were a rail track there, brick factory, chain factory, and barracks, and on the banks of river Sava. And from these few photos, we had, this kind of feels fairly close to it, and there is pretty much, we found this old abandoned brick factory. And fortunately, there was a rail tracks nearby. They were not functional, actually there was another 9 kilometers missing to the connecting rail, and we had to bring a train on the trucks and put on this. First, we had to rebuild this whole track, in front of the brick factory that it can support the train. Then we brought a, train and the cars on the trucks, and we put it on. And actually, I think we got a very, very good, setup and very close to what is Jasenovac, or what Jasenovac was looking like, But as Michael said, it was leveled, but from those few photos and some, description of survivors, I think this is pretty accurate, as much as you can, do it nowadays.
And
Let me
go ahead, Michael.
Let me add one sentence, which is that railroad tracks were essential because railroad tracks made the victims mobile and the killing center stationary. And they meant that that meant that the killers didn't have to travel, and you could arrange it so that they remained stable. And all you did was to have arriving new prisoners, and they were eliminated. So railroad tracks were an indispensable part of this killing operation. That's why all the camps were built along railroad lines.
Gaga, tell me about working with Milos Kodemo, your director of photography. In particular, the colors, the visual. There's a lot of browns. There's a lot of yellows. Tell us about the photography.
Milos and I basically are working together. It's our second movie and fourth series, because 5-6 years ago he started working with me, and I simply now consider him part of the family, and we like working with each other. He's exceptionally talented young man, and clearly the photography in this movie contributed a lot, and it was obviously choice, and big choice. How do you opt for a cold or warm colors to begin with? That's a kind of a very important decision, because there was a possibility to go that gray greenish look, almost rainy look to the whole story, or to go with this, as you said, yellow brown colors. We opted for this approach because we wanted to counter the looks, with the horrors at the same time, and I think it was the right decision, because we were afraid if we, on these horrible events we are depicting, if we add also the darkness and the grayness and rain and the mud, it would actually just become way too much. I think it was a way of lightening up the visuals of everything, but at the same time serves as a big contrast to the events which are unfolding.
Yeah, and then also you have this lyrical moments, if I can call them that, where we have this, we see the people that have died, and they go inside the train. Can you tell us about how that you arrived to those passages?
Yeah, that came later as we were progressing with the movie, because after doing some scenes, I felt I have to continue, telling this story of people dying, but I need the breather. But the breather cannot be about butterfly flying in the field and young girl chasing it. It has to be still a metaphor about death. It cannot be departing and going away, out there in order to counter these horrors. And that's why I came up with this idea of this train, which basically, it is a breather, but it is not. But on the philosophical standpoint, it does keep these victims alive. As I also wish to remember them when I think of them. That's why this train is a train of death, but it's also in a way train of sainthood of some sorts, you know, for all of them as victims.
It also reminds us that they're not corpses, but they really were living people.
Yep.
Gaga, finding Dara, Biljana Čekić, the young girl, you know, tell us about finding her.
She was one of around 1,500 people we found, you know, in these villages, because we wanted to go for the kids who never saw a day of acting, you know, classes or school, you know, because I just wanted the diamonds in the rough, you know, and to go from there. And throughout the process, she kind of, you know, showed up at some point, and we all sensed that that's it, you know. But we of course continued, you know, selection, narrowing down to 40, and then to, you know, few. But it was clear that she was it. But still, you know, I gave her, like, for instance, as we were, you know, deciding whether to take her as a lead, I gave her some pages of some dialogues, which was like 3 pages plus, you know, of dialogue. And that was not necessarily what she would be doing later in the movie, but she would like do the whole scene with a professional actor without missing the line, you know, and holding the, you know, the scene between 2 of them very successfully. But then comes first day of shooting, which is just the beginning of the movie. And I'm thinking, okay, that was fine. We had these, you know, tests with, you know, few people in the room, but what now? Because there are 300 extras, 100 and some, you know, crew members. And what if she can't do it? If she gets scared, if she, you know, start, you know, losing it? I knew that I would need to stop the movie. You know, I would not continue production because it would be outright silly to shoot the movie and not have your lead, who happened to be a kid, who can actually carry on her shoulders the entire story. But we were blessed. She was just fantastic and proved to be fantastic. Those eyes, very hard to, you know, it doesn't come in our you know, industry, in our let's say art, doesn't come that often, you know, that talent. Like
Yes,
this.
no, she's very expressive, very beautiful face. And what has been the reaction in your country to the film? I mean, obviously, it's the official selection for the Academy Awards, but what has been the reaction in the country?
This is the situation. Film had a very brief theatrical run, you know, just to kind of qualify for the, you know, Academy, those so-called, you know, usually a week, you know, of because the Corona time, the theaters were shut down. Mostly we started in one town, then 2 days later, they kind of shut down the theaters. Then we moved to another town, happened again. But then finally we were able to have like a full week of a continuous run of the movie. We will run the movie in the theaters, hopefully in April, because we are just hoping that by then, you know, people will start going back to the theaters, because now it's non-existent, you know, thing, and we want obviously as many people to see the movie as possible. However, the movie became already like, let's say, subject of, you know, reactions in Croatia and in Serbia as well, because of the subject matter. Not that many people saw movie really, but it's already a war on IMDb where Croats are putting 1 and the Serbs are putting 10, but nobody saw the movie. You know, it's kind of like a bizarre situation. It's because of a subject matter. It's something that was long overdue. I wish this movie was done decades before, because maybe that pus in this wound, you know, between the Serbs and Croats would have been, you know, taken out, and maybe there will be some healing and reconciliation. But here we are, and I think movie will eventually do very good, because it's done with no bad intentions. It clearly, let's say, makes the difference between Croatian people and Nazis, Croatian Nazis, Ustaše. You know, you have this, you know, woman at the beginning who saves the kids. You have the woman in the end who basically, historic figure, also saved lots of kids. You know, but also you had these Ustaše guys who were doing what they were doing. You know, that's kind of inevitable. And essentially, I think it would be important for both Serbs and Croats to see this movie, because it is based on the facts. It has no, let's say, intentions except to tell this story and to remind us all that these things should not repeat itself ever again. You know, because in Balkans, but also everywhere else, it could happen any time.
It successfully gives you what we call in history the gray zone, which is that bad people who have done horrific things can have moments and glimpses of decency, and victims can sometimes be put in such a compromised situation that they victimize, that they as victims victimize others. And that makes it really a depiction of ordinary people facing the most extraordinary of circumstances. I once wrote of this that Hannah Arendt, the great philosopher, said there was the banality of evil, but Gaga's got it right. There's not the banality of evil. The evil is horrific, but there's the banality of the evildoer. It's the ordinary person put into the most extraordinary of circumstances, in which some rise and some fall, and some have good moments in their good moments despite the darkness of their behavior, and others have moments of compromise despite the fact that they're victims. Everybody emerged changed and charred by the circumstances.
Well, gentlemen, thank you so much for your time. It's been very instructional for us to listen to you both. It's a powerful film, Gaga, very powerful. Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for